The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, how we can create and keep manufacturing jobs in America, plus a legal and political history of the DREAM Act and DACA. And Bill Press with David Frum, author of Trumpocalypse, Restoring American Democracy. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. As head of North America's largest industrial union, Tom Conway speaks for over 800,000 workers. He says now more than ever, we need to protect working people and fight to rebuild our nation's manufacturing muscle. And we say hello to Tom Conway, International President of the United Steelworkers Union. Tom, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Oh, that's good. It's my pleasure.
But our pleasure to have you with us. You've been writing and talking about rebuilding American manufacturing for some time now. And recently, you've noted that during this pandemic, the decline in American manufacturing has actually put the nation at risk. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think manufacturing has been struggling for a long time as a result of free trade agreements, about an effort to offshore work, people literally just chasing a cheaper labor cost and a place to operate without environmental rules. And we've seen that hollow out a lot of jobs in a lot of communities. And we've lost, by some estimates, nearly 6 million jobs in the manufacturing sector over the last decade. But I think when this pandemic hit, people realized that America could no longer even produce its own sort of safety gear. We had a scramble to try and get masks from Asia and gowns and ventilators, and that industry had largely been offshored. And so we had all the states having a look to Asia. They got in a bidding war amongst themselves, and for 2 months, we really struggled to figure out where are we going to get the stuff we need to deal with the healthcare concerns going on in this. And I think that has been eye-opening for people, as it should be. And so the country's supply chain needs to be reliable. And there's certainly a market for those products here because they're coming in from offshore. They ought to be done here. And we ought to know who's making those kind of things and who's making whatever products we may need in the U.S. And so they're easily accessible. We know what the quality is, and we know that we can get it when we need it. And, sort of just quit chasing the cheapest price we can get out of anything.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've also been speaking out about our nation's failure to invest in infrastructure. How do you see that failure playing out in American lives right now?
2 weeks ago in Midland, Michigan, 2 dams failed and flooded entire communities, wiped them out, homes under 25 foot of water. But those dams and the risk associated with them and their condition had been known for years and years, 20 years, but nothing was done about it. And we keep trying to rely on an infrastructure and bridges that the engineers, the organization of engineers who rate America's bridges, rate our bridge system in the U.S. at a D+. We leak 1 trillion gallons of fresh water a year in the country because our water systems and our piping systems are old and decaying. And you just can't allow that to happen to your infrastructure. And, look, Americans have a lot of common sense. If you never changed the oil in your car, or if you didn't do minor maintenance, or if you didn't take care of your home, it eventually is going to fail on you. And America is sort of running to fail on its infrastructure, and it's going to take a big investment. And at a time like this, when the country is trying to figure out, all right, we now have 40 million people out of work, and some will go back to work, but a lot won't. There's a lot that's changed in this economy, in this pandemic, when you look out over the horizon. So a big infrastructure investment that puts people to work, that does training, that has a long-term scope to it, is the kind of shot in the arm we need. And it's a minimum of $1 trillion investment, but it's an investment for our future that we have to make, or the country is just going to be so inefficient and so enabled to meet its own needs. So, look, infrastructure it builds a manufacturing supply chain. It has upstream and downstream possibilities that come with it, and it put a lot of people to work. And it's not just bridges and roads. It's a broadband system. It's in a new electrical grid that doesn't have 8 and 9% of yield drop across of it. There's a fiber optic system that constantly needs to be installed. I mean, there's all kinds of work to do, and we just aren't doing it in any systematic way or any planned way.
Well, and you've written that an infrastructure campaign is more essential now than ever. But what would it actually look like? If you were going to draw all that up, what would that look like?
Look, there's a lot of different components to it, and infrastructure isn't one thing. It's sort of a review of our transportation systems, our rail systems, building electric buses and electric trains in the U.S., making sure our interstate systems are repaired and operating right, making sure our electric grid works, our water systems work, that our gas systems aren't leaking methane. If I often thought if I could get with a bunch of companies who make appliances and then with the service providers in each area, the gas and electric companies, and couple them together and have them train teams of people who could go into each home and outfit each home with high energy, 5-star efficiency appliances, hot water heaters, dryers, washers, kitchen appliances, furnaces, and train people to do sort of house sealing, caulking, windows. You could train an army of people. You could find a way to pay for those things initially through seed money through the government with a long-term payback on people's monthly bill. And the money that we would save in energy loss and yield drop and leakage in every home would be tremendous. This is a project that could go on for 20 or 30 years, and we would build skills into a group of people who are going to need jobs, and these are good, skilled jobs. I mean, there are ways to do this if people want to set their mind to it and incubate a system like that.
Yeah, and as you said, and it's creating additional jobs, newer jobs as well. We're speaking with Tom Conway, International President of the United Steelworkers Union. And Tom, some people have said that if and when we emerge from this pandemic, and Lord knows we hope we all do, there will be an opportunity for America to reinvent itself. Assuming that is true, what is it you would like to see in terms of how we approach manufacturing?
Look, on manufacturing, we have to decide we're no longer going to rely on Asia, on places that the only advantage they have is to take advantage of either their peoples or just create things in a non-sustainable way. So if you've got, a country like China who's making steel, for example, and they're putting 3.5 or 4 or multiple 3.5, 4 tons of carbon into the air as opposed to making that steel here, then I think that's a consideration people need to take a look at. And it's not just price, because you don't get something cheap for no reason. And we need a policy in America that looks at our manufacturing and isn't just leave it all to the market. And this sort of, the economists are out there saying, well, this is all just the invisible hand of the market. The market does what the market wants to. That's just not true. This is not God created. These are a function of laws that are created by lobbyists and lawyers and corporations who want to take this work offshore because they're doing an arbitrage on labor, on the climate, on sustainability, and that's the margin they're making their money off of. And that's not a competitive advantage. They're creating that advantage, and it's not a natural competitive advantage that ought to be considered in trade. I mean, we're not trying to stop all trade. We're not naive about this globe and the way that it interacts with each other. But trade should not be the basis of your foreign policy program, and it shouldn't be based on exploitive methods in which you're either exploiting the people who are making the products that you're shipping back here. And the idea that a company who's been in the U.S. for 50 or 100 years has created some legacy, has a community that relies on that employer, and that's often the case. They then leave the country, they go make their stuff in Mexico, or they make it in Asia, and ship it right back to the place where they always were, and expect to enter that market now with this extremely cheap product. And we don't try and stop that. We think we don't have a right to step forward and say, no, you're not going to do that. You're not going to take advantage of all that. And if those companies aren't here, they're not lending to the investment in infrastructure. They don't have the skin in the game that they ought to have, having access to this market, and in many cases having left it behind. So I think we need a government who understands that and understands the need to speak up to companies and say, this is not the Wild West. You're not going to do anything you want to do and leave people behind in the way that's happened in this country. Look, manufacturing used to be the biggest component of the country's GDP, and finance was a fraction of that, and it supported manufacturing. And we believe that if you're not making something, if you're not mining it, milling it, put some capital and labor against it, add value to it, and make a product and bring it to the market, that's where there's value. That's where you create jobs. You don't create value with a bunch of algorithms and Wall Street money manipulation, and that's not sustainable. And you can't just have a country that's running off of hospitality and restaurant systems. Somewhere you need to make something and sell it, and we're losing our ability to do that in this country, and it's something we ought to be very concerned about.
Mm-hmm. And Tom, your union represents some 850,000 men and women, and we can't have this conversation without talking about what they need in the middle of this pandemic. As Congress continues to design recovery plans, what do they need to do to protect the workers that you represent?
Look, I think a lot of workers, there's sort of two things going on. The pandemic has had some immediate effect and has shut down operations, and they will come back. And some of them pretty quickly, others not. But all that's happened here is not just solely a function of the COVID pandemic. There is also an underlying economic problem that's been going on in the country, and this sort of brought it to surface. And we see it in a lot of our basic materials and in manufacturing that is here. And I think we're in for a tough ride out of here. And people who say, well, this recovery is going to snap right back. It's going to be a V-shaped recovery. I think that's very naive. And so people need to know what jobs are going to look like in the future. And there needs to be sort of a fundamental overhaul of America's kind of pay systems, a recognition of what people are doing. And that's going to be a big, big challenge. But I don't know how we say to workers, you're an essential worker, and we need you to go to work and take care of people and help heal them or transport them or show up in emergency systems and drive our ambulances, move our transportation systems, and we're going to pay you $10 an hour. It's just not a fair system. And so we fight, we squabble about trying to get to a $15 minimum wage, and you hear corporations and capital in this country scream like stuck pigs over something like that. But you're not going to have a country and a consumer-driven economy if you don't put money into it. And so, what they've done so far to sort of bridge through the layoffs with the $600 has been helpful and has helped a lot of people. But you really do need to create jobs. And I think this is the time for America to do a massive investment in a jobs program with an infrastructure program. And there's ways to keep people safe at work. And we now understand what we need in terms of PPE, how social distancing will work, how we can make sure that there are safe workplaces. And in our union, we have safety committees who work with the management and deal with those issues in real time as they come up on a day-to-day basis, and deal with the fact that some people will contract this and some won't, and how do you deal with that in the factory. But besides just getting through the virus, getting through this economy and the need to fundamentally restructure the way America works, I think that's a big challenge ahead of us. But if we don't do it and we try and just go back to the way things were, it's not solving a problem for us. So I think this is a time for the country to do something kind of really quantum leap, and we're going to have to spend our way out of this problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there's the New Deal. I mean, that did something, back in the 20th century, and perhaps
Right.
It's a Green New Deal or some other same sort of investment in the American workforce to get us back on the right track.
Look, back then they created the Civilian Conservation Corps and the WPA, and they tried a lot of other different things. Not every one of them worked, but you got to start trying. And so
Right.
Here, there are a lot of things that we can do that can improve this nation and put it on a good path going forward for a long time. Give people skills, give people an opportunity. If you're a young person in America, or you're a millennial, I mean, think back about what's happened over their lifetime. As young persons, we had 9/11 and what that did to the country. And about the time we're crawling out of that, hits the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, and dials it back again. And now, 10 years later, we've been hit with this virus, which has completely shut down our nation for 2 months. And so if you're 35, 40 years old, you've never had a chance to sort of get yourself established, to get on your feet, to get into a career and have a career path moving forward, because there's this trauma that keeps befalling the country. And there's a generation of people that we've got to reach out to and provide them an opportunity, because they are the future when this baby boom generation moves on. And we've got to give them a chance in this country. And if we won't invest in the country, I don't know how we can expect them to succeed.
Amen. Tom Conway, International President of the United Steelworkers Union, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Tom, we certainly appreciate your time with us today and would love to have you back and talk more about this sometime down the road.
Okay, I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, the uncertain future of young undocumented immigrants in America and how we got here. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
As directed by their big business funders, top Republican office holders across the country have been defying public health experts in past weeks to rush America's workers back into their jobs. But oops, the microscopic COVID-19 turns out to be smarter and stronger than Trump and all the money-grubbing CEOs combined. So their impetuous back-to-work commands have backfired, causing the crisis to surge again, killing thousands more Americans. What to do now? Why, of course, get Congress to protect them. Not protect workers and customers, but protect corporate profits. Thus, the White House, such congressional sleazes as Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell and the whole army of Gucci-wearing corporate lobbyists are pushing furiously to pass a law decreeing that corporations cannot be held liable for profit-driven actions and negligence that sicken and kill untold numbers of Americans. Crying crocodile tears for those giants, Trump's corporate-hugging economic advisor wailed, "You've got to give business some confidence here that if something happens, you can't take them out of business. You can't throw big lawsuits at them." Gosh, thanks for your little moral lecture, but what about giving workers, their families, and society in general some confidence that if something happens, you can't take away people's basic human right to pursue justice? Besides, why shouldn't we the people hold these economic powerhouses legally accountable? By preemptively giving a blanket pardon to corporate entities for causing deadly harm, you'll give direct financial incentive to their executives to forego investing in protective measures for workers and public health. Indeed, the very fact they're insisting on a law to shield them is an admission that they know the rush to restart their profit machine will sicken and kill others. This is Jim Hightower saying that's not just greedy, it's inhumane.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Michael Olivas has written the first comprehensive history of the DREAM Act and DACA. It's an exhaustive examination of how politicians have gone wrong serving young, undocumented immigrants and how they could still go right. And we say hello to Michael Olivas, Professor Emeritus of Law, University of Houston Law Center, and Interim President, University of Houston Downtown. He taught immigration, higher education law, and entertainment law. He also has a weekly NPR show, The Law of Rock and Roll, and he is the author of Perchance to Dream, a legal and political history of the DREAM Act and DACA. Michael Olivas, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm very glad to be here.
And our pleasure to have you with us. As the title of your book makes clear, this is a history of the DREAM Act and DACA. Why is it so important that this history be told?
Well, it's interesting. Although there's been an awful lot written about the programs, both the DREAM Act and DACA, as well as other kinds of fits and starts, this is the first full-length book on the subject of sort of how it came to be. And I trace its roots, frankly, all the way back to the 1800s, only in this sense. This early on started out as how these students who were neither fish nor fowl could become resident students for tuition purposes. And there are cases that go all the way back to the 1800s saying if you live in a certain jurisdiction, a state, or a subsection of that for community colleges, then you can get in-state tuition and you pay less. When I started teaching at the University of Houston in 1982, in-state tuition was $4 an hour. Out-of-state tuition was 10x. Whatever it was ratcheted up by a power of 10. That made a lot of difference for undocumented students who, for the most part, couldn't work, were ineligible for financial aid and so forth. So in the 1970s, a lot of undocumented students, and I'm talking about dozens, began to apply, and when they were denied residency or domicile in their state, they were charged more tuition, and they successfully, in most cases, sued, saying we're resident here. So I go back to the 70s and look at an entire layer of litigation as well as legislation that occurred. I occasionally meet people not much younger than I am. I'm 69, who are part of what they call the Leticia A cohort. Leticia A was the leading case in California. It sort of whipsawed back and forth. First, it gave them in-state tuition at the University of California, but not the Cal State and not the community college, which of course is where most of the students are. And so there was litigation, and this was pretty much a hidden history. That is, people in California who were applying to school knew about it. And you might know in-state tuition in your own state, but you didn't realize that there was this national series of cases that were erupting and forming the kind of common law for the first issue, which was how can you afford to be in school? This was before immigration enforcement really became so dire. That occurred for the most part after Prop 187 in California, which led to massive anti-immigrant, nativist kinds of program reductions, including residency tuition. It also tried to overturn Plyler versus Doe, which was the 1982 Supreme Court case that said undocumented children or children of undocumented parents not only could attend school without tuition, but they were obligated to attend school because of truancy laws. And so at one time, either the students or the parents could have been held in contempt of court because they were not being allowed to attend school, or they were being charged prohibitive tuition for what's supposed to be public free education. At the same time, such as in Texas, where the case arose, they were never exempt from the truancy laws. So what happens when Plyler, which by the way was probably the high water mark of immigrant rights, Plyler versus Doe is widely considered to be the most pro-immigrant case ever brought, in part because it head-on attacked exclusionary practices that occurred at the thousands of school districts. But it also enabled these students and their parents to stay if they weren't apprehended otherwise. And the court even held that being undocumented did not preclude them from having domicile. in the United States because they made it their true permanent fixed abode was to come here. And so these kids grow up, and what happens when Doe wants to go to college? Well, that's the beginning of Leticia A. and other cases that have arisen since that time. And the informal term, the Dreamers, became their rallying call. And so I track this through these cases, through interviews, through a lot of social science about how social movements occur when people have a cohort that they can identify with and so forth. So that's really what I do. And then at the end, of course, after 10 years, I tried to take a cut at what would happen with the case that was pending. It was heard in November. And that's where technically the book ends, although I snuck in a few minor things when I was editing the galley proofs about 6 weeks ago. But it's available in fine bookstores everywhere now.
we were definitely going to mention that at some point. Hey, let's take a look at the DREAM Act, which was first introduced in 2001. What was the problem it was supposed to fix?
Well, this, instead of trying to do this state by state, where there'd been some successes and some failures, it was particularly uneven in California, which is, of course, the state with the largest number of undocumented students. So there was an attempt to have a federal law that would affect this. There actually was law for those who really have nothing better to do. It's sections 1612 and 1613 of the Immigration Code, but that's not really the point. There they said that as long as a state made affirmative actions to allow students to receive benefits, they could do so. Otherwise, they were ineligible. And that became the law of the land, although it was unevenly applied because there were relatively few cases that rose to a federal level because there was almost always interpretation of a state statute. And the problem with state statutes is that they make a patchwork. And so where you happen to grow up or where you happen to live affects you. And if you move, you got to start the clock all over again. And so going federal was the only pathway, and it was introduced originally by Senator Kennedy, the liberal lion on the Senate, but also the well-known conservative Senator Orrin Hatch from Utah. And I figured with those two guys as the bookends that it was bound to pass because it covered the whole waterfront. And I took that bet in writing in several different publications and ended up losing the bet. It has passed both chambers, but never at the same time. And so while it is true that right now the Promise Act has been signed by the House, the Senate has not even taken it up or had hearings or anything else. And the silence is deafening because really virtually all public polls that are available show widespread support for these kids. And we've got 800,000 of them now, and no one wants to deport 800,000 kids, especially after we've invested in them with Plyler and with in-state tuition and our own efforts.
Well, and here we are 19 years later, and the DREAM Act still has not become law. How do you explain the inability of Congress, especially when you talk about those bookends, Kennedy and Hatch, their inability to pass the DREAM Act?
Well, the funny thing is, in 1986, of course, that famous liberal President Reagan enacted and approved and signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act. And that helped people legalize their status, so it took a little bit of the heat off, but still, it was still 4 or 5 years after Plyler, and the DREAM Act was simply a glint in the eye, but it redeemed it because redeemed the situation because it allowed people who didn't have legal status to legalize their status, and so it took the heat off somewhat. That, of course, now we have neither. Now we have neither DREAM Act, and the Immigration Reform and Control Act is sadly out of date. That law, of course, not only gave legalization, most of which those cases are all processed and people are citizens now, but it did leave us with employer sanctions, which is the major distinction. So we now sort of have the worst of both worlds. And President Trump has said, well, I love the Dreamers. Everybody loves the Dreamers. But he hasn't ever given a signal that he would support it. That's all he would have to do, was to give that.
He says a lot of things that, well, we don't need to go into all that right now, but
that's another rant on another day.
Right, that's right. We'll have to have you back for that conversation. But in response to the failure of the DREAM Act legislation to pass both houses of Congress, President Obama, by executive action of prosecutorial discretion, initiated DACA, which is, of course, for those that don't recall, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and that was in 2012. How is it different from the DREAM Act?
Well, it never was law. It was informal choices of who was going to be a high priority for prosecution or removal or deportation, which happens on a daily basis in every single law office. If you decide you want to stroll across Lafayette Park and the Attorney General wants to wage war on protesters and hold up a Bible, then that's just the fact that people would be arrested or prosecuted would be within the kind of prosecutorial discretion that every legal office has. So President Obama knew the limits. And by the way, in order to prepare for this, he had become so successful in deporting people that many of my colleagues called him the deporter in chief. I never called him that because I always knew that what he was trying to do was to establish the bona fides of his administration in removing people. And he actually deported 400,000 a year, probably the max that we could actually process in a given year, for all of those years. He deported many more people than anybody else had. And other presidents, by the way, including George Bush, who preceded him, used prosecutorial discretion for dealing with students in New Orleans during Katrina, international students, when their schools closed, they were no longer making the kind of satisfactory progress that is required by their terms of staying enrolled in the United States and not being deportable. And he said, do what your school does. If they postpone, fine. And so he was very flexible in that regard, and no one busted his chops for that. It was clearly in reaction to a very difficult legal situation where these students were being pushed out of status, not for their own failure to attend school, but because the schools were no longer operating at that time. Sort of like with COVID. And actually there's some tie-ins there that could also be the rant for another day. But the interesting piece of this, especially in my own work, is that the very first case of prosecutorial discretion that was ever litigated was John Lennon of the Beatles. He was in the United States, having married Yoko Ono, and from her first marriage, she had a daughter, and the ex-husband, had absconded with her daughter. Turned out he was hiding out in Houston, and the case was actually litigated in Houston. But his lawyer, who's still alive, argued that this kind of prosecutorial discretion was simply shuffling papers to the bottom of the enforcement pile. And as long as you weren't a public danger, no threat, they would look the other way and sort of hold on to it. But it was not published anywhere. It was not a regulation. It was what the lawyer called secret law. And he litigated. He was going to be removed from the United States because of some early drug convictions in England. And he wanted to stay while Yoko and he looked for the daughter. So he was not a threat, although President Nixon at the time thought of him as a major threat. So he was trying to deport him, but in a very important case, prosecutorial discretion was born as a formal legal concept. Before, you couldn't even apply for it. It could be applied by the government, but you can't apply for it as an immigrant. So it was very one-sided. It was discretion that nobody knew about. You didn't know what the rules were. So that concept, about which several books have been written, including one where that original lawyer wrote the foreword to the book. So it's a very interesting convergence. And now it's widespread. And when this case was, when this policy was enacted, immediately I was actually writing an article saying this is a bad idea because you have to reveal all of the information to the government. they would not only know where you lived, because most of these kids lived with their parents, and so it put their parents at risk as well. But I thought that because it had made an option that you might have, if you can prove a hardship, you might have employment authorization, which was the key concept. Then it was optional. I said, you're giving up biometric information, you're giving up DNA, you're giving up all this personal information about where you live, all of this information, and there's no guarantee that you're going to get anything in return. It was very discretionary. But then as it started to roll out, it was clear they got three things. All these applicants got three things. They got a social security number so that you could work. They got employment authorization, which means you had permission to work anywhere for which you were eligible. And third, they got what's called lawful presence. Lawful presence means that at the moment you're not deportable. They had suspended their deportation and their deportability as long as they were in fulfillment of all these terms. And of course, they were. Very few students, once they signed up, ever lost it because of some drunk driving or something. When they did lose it, it was usually because of that. A couple of students also left the United States and came back without permission. But even then, they had made what's called advanced parole possible, meaning you could leave to go to Mexico because your grandmother died and you could come back. And because you had this kind of prophylactic shield around yourself, meaning you weren't deportable, and the burden was on the government to remove you. They couldn't automatically deport you and then you fight it. They had to fight to remove you. So all of these worked in their favor, and of course, 800,000 students signed up. So pretty soon we had lawyers, doctors, teachers, scientists, physicians, and these kids have done remarkably well, even though they were ineligible for all federal financial aid, even though they cannot become legalized through this. This is a pathway only to buy time. So the sword of Damocles is hanging over their heads still. Even if the Supreme Court were to rule in their favor today, all it would do would be buy more time.
Now, I'm going to jump ahead. But before Trump was elected,
yes,
DACA faced political opposition, even though it had support among the public. What drove that opposition, and how effective was it in limiting the reach of DACA?
Well, it wasn't effective. The opposition came from the immigration authorities, who would do the adjudication because it took away their discretion. If you became eligible, there's no point system or anything else. If you were eligible, you got all these benefits. No longer did you have to prove the extra hardship and so forth that I had feared at the beginning. So it became so successful that very few people were not admitted to it. When they weren't, it was because they had some misdemeanors like drunk driving or something like that, or more serious. Most of them actually didn't apply because they knew the rules, or they couldn't afford the fees, which were about $500, which for undocumented students really quite a bit. And this was 10 years ago, almost 10 years. So the opposition was, for the most part, from the immigration authorities themselves, and they lost that case. In fact, virtually all the cases had been lost until a Texas case occurred, and a judge in Brownsville said that this was illegal because it was trying to do what only laws can do, that immigration law can be changed only by Congress, not even by the president. He was incorrect on that, and the Supreme Court tied 4-4 on that matter when it first went to them. That was, by the way, after Justice Scalia had died, and McConnell was sitting on it to try and run out the clock on that. So Merrick Garland had been nominated, but he never got the courtesy of a hearing or anything else. So that it was tied 4-4, and it went back, and that upheld it. But then litigants, myself included, I serve on the MALDEF board, the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund board, and we were one of the participants in this. And we began trying to slow down the gears. And then President Obama felt so successful about this program that he added a program called DAPA, which stood for Deferred Action for Parents of Arrivals. So if there were undocumented parents who had citizen children, the parents would get some relief. That turned out to be a bridge too far, and it brought down a hailstorm, including this judge who said that much, he's trying to make law. I will not decide on the constitutionality because that wasn't really in front of him at the time. He sort of punted on that, saying, well, the eggs have all been scrambled and the Supreme Court didn't rule on this definitively. And there were these other cases that arose, including the ones that are at the Supreme Court right now that will be decided any day, which leads us then to DACA today. But there was some opposition. It wasn't in the general public, and it certainly wasn't with the educators.
We're speaking with Michael Olivas, Professor Emeritus of Law, University of Houston Law Center, and Interim President, University of Houston Downtown. He has a weekly NPR show, The Law of Rock and Roll, and he's also the author of Perchance to Dream, a legal and political history of the DREAM Act and DACA. So now we have Trump and his nativist agenda and his campaign to simply get rid of DACA. We may soon find out, as you alluded to, if he will be successful in that as we await a Supreme Court ruling. What is your sense of what may happen?
Well, the true issue is not whether or not he has the authority to undo some discretionary program. The nature of discretion means you can do it or choose not to do it. He could have easily shut this down, but as usual, he tried to avoid following the rules. So he did not follow the Administrative Procedures Act. The Administrative Procedures Act requires notice and comment for such a program as this, where you put out what your intent is, people comment on it, you take into account all of the responses, usually thousands, and then you announce it and you publish it in the Federal Register. And so it's all done that way. Here they simply said, this is illegal. I rolled over in bed today and decided this was illegal, and so I'm shutting it down. Well, agencies don't get to determine what's illegal and what isn't, and they didn't ask for notice and comments and so forth. So if the best we could hope for right now is that they did it wrong, just like they did with the census, by the way, where they lied about the reasons for trying to include racial questions on the census. And they only found out because the consultant died and left the details in his notes, and his daughter found them and entered them into the record, saying he knew that the census racial questions would cause minorities, especially people out of legal status, not to answer the census. So they would be undercounted, which was what the Republicans really wanted. But the Republicans wouldn't own up to it. And they finally were called out for lying. And Chief Justice Roberts wrote the decision on that, which I think sort of goes against his instincts because they didn't follow the rules. And if the government doesn't follow the rules, there's no sense in having rules whatsoever, and all we have is anarchy. So if they said you have to do A, B, and C, even this gang that can't shoot straight would be able to do A, B, and C and shut it down. That would buy us time, at least until November, when we hope that the rules would change because of a change of administration. All that said, we could lose by saying, well, it was inconvenient, but they could have shut it down, and if they didn't follow the rules, that would be inconsistent with the census case, which was just 6 months ago. So I think that what's going to end up is they will say they didn't follow the APA. By the way, they've been involved in over 30 different cases where they didn't follow the APA. This is like law school first-year class in civil procedure. So the best we could do, I think, is get some time. And then it would be around, by the time this would be shut down, because they did stop new people from applying. So this is now like the Civil War's Widows Relief Fund, where you start out with 10,000 Civil War widows and they start dying. And then finally you're down to the last 3 who are 106 still drawing those checks and smoking corncob pipes. These students have been able to renew it for 2 years, and they will start falling out, and they will lose employment authorization, and then they'll start being fired. And we've already gone to court about a dozen times because employers say, well, this isn't real employment authorization. Truth is, employment authorization is employment authorization, and we've won each one of those cases. The nice thing is that lawful presence becomes the most important feature, because it means you can't be deported, but it also means you are eligible for any number of occupational licenses. So one of my book chapters is a national study of high-end positions: lawyer, doctor, Indian chief, et cetera. And it turns out that a number of states, as long as you are lawfully present, you can become a lawyer if you're otherwise eligible, or if you can work, or if you have a Social Security number. Well, how convenient. Here's a DACA student. So in California, the leading case since that time has been a case called Sergio Garcia. Not the golfer, Sergio Garcia, but another one who was too old to be in DACA. He had aged out. So he applied, passed the bar, and the state bar said, well, we're not sure we can admit you because of the other collateral legislation I mentioned earlier, and you don't have DACA. So they passed a special relief bill for him, the Sergio Garcia bill, and he was allowed to stay. And so now, not only can documented lawyers in California become licensed, but so can undocumented lawyers. The only state that actually passed a law, which, as I had indicated earlier, other provisions say as long as the state passes the law. But whoever figured you get 800,000 kids moving along in this cohort who are going to present these kinds of credentials? But it turns out that most states really didn't have anything excluding them from practice because it never intended for them. Usually this discretion or these kinds of DACA predecessors were temporary. You might get work if you really were going to stay a little bit. John Lennon, of course, didn't need the money, but he needed the time, so he was allowed to stay here. He could even leave the country, as he did, to go to, you may remember his bed-ins in Canada, and come back into the country because he had advanced parole. It's a very valuable, but usually fleeting kind of program. And that's what I think many people have objected to. And of course, now we have these 800,000 students who are eligible, who intermarry with our families, who are our students, who are our doctors. An extra brief was submitted to the Supreme Court about a month ago, showing that hundreds of DACA students are now public health professionals, nurses, and doctors. So there was an emergency, and could that be taken into account? Well, fact is, there's only been one Supreme Court case since before November, that hasn't been announced yet. So every day I wake up in the morning and I go to SCOTUS blog to see what's coming up, and have a Zoom press conference scheduled that the University of Houston setting up. We've already got almost 50 reporters, such as yourself, mostly print reporters, I think, who are going to want to have this kind of exchange. I'm going to have to get it down a bit because I realize I'm still talking through book points instead of sharper points, but I'll be at my A game, and I'll have to read it quickly. And I'd like to get the first word in. Getting the last word in here is clearly going to be the administration, whether or not they win or lose, because either way, they will have action that they can pursue. If, as I say, even if it's given a reprieve, the steps of what they have to do will be there. The question is whether or not they'll have enough time, and whether or not that's a high enough priority in the next couple of months during the campaign and so forth.
Okay, and we'll have.
They're also busy detaining children and adults elsewhere, so the immigration authorities got plenty of food on their plate.
Right, absolutely, and unfortunately we have to leave it there. Michael Olivas, Professor Emeritus of Law, University of Houston Law Center, and Interim President, University of Houston Downtown. You can check out his weekly NPR show, The Law of Rock and Roll, and certainly at pretty much any decent bookstore in the country. Perchance to Dream is his book, A Legal and Political History of the DREAM Act and DACA. Michael, thank you so much for your time with us today on the America's Democrats podcast. We love to have you back again soon.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. From the front line of the Republican resistance to Trump, David Frum joins Bill Press to talk about his new book, Trumpocalypse.
A couple of times in the book you mention, right up front and again toward the end, that we have survived 4 years of Donald Trump, but we could not survive another 4 years. I know you believe that. Why?
Well, let's talk first abroad and then at home.
Okay.
I think the damage abroad, it has been worse and faster. No friend of America can look at the past 4 years and ever feel the same way about the United States again, even if the next president goes around the world swearing, look, this was a mistake. We will never do this again. We're repealing all these crazy tariffs that we applied on so promiscuously with no basis. We are reaffirming our commitment to allies. Estonia, when we said it would whether we would honor our treaty with you, that depended on how the president felt that day. Forget all that. No one can forget all that. It happened. If it happened once, it can happen again. Countries have to plan for the 20, 30, 40-year term. And nobody who relies on America can feel sure that this is impossible to ever recur. So it changes their thinking. And then here at home, the real worry I have is that normally parties compete for votes. But since 2010 especially, the Republican Party's gotten to an idea. We don't have to change our message if we can shrink the electorate instead of competing for it. And so we have had, enabled by certain changes in the law, the shrinkage of the Voting Rights Act after 2013, we're seeing in the Republican side a conscious and articulate strategy of competing for power by shrinking the electorate.
In several different ways, right?
In several different ways. So one of the things I'm interested in in my program of reform is I want to see a Republican Party that competes. And I think it's very important for the Republican future to remove the option of shrinking the electorate and say, you got to take the voters as they are. And then you may be surprised, conservatives, how open a lot of Americans are to your message once you stop insulting people and saying we are going to govern without regard to big parts of the country.
Now, I want to ask you about something that's very much in the news these days. According to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, and others, the Russians were offering cash bounties to members of the Taliban to kill American soldiers. If true, and as I say, there's some solid reporting, it seems, behind it, what does that tell you about Donald Trump's leadership? He says he never knew about it.
Well, I want to be really careful about not getting too far ahead of this story because it is so explosive that we need to move very exactly. So, but here's what I think we can say. People in the intelligence and defense world are really obviously upset about this story. And they are leaking details so that each denial from Donald Trump and the people around him is responded to by another leak that refutes the denial. So Trump says, I was never briefed. There's a leak. You were briefed. And not only were you briefed, but there's a National Security Council meeting on the subject. So it's hard to back away. And I think it's also very noteworthy that the story, while it's been denied as of the time you and I speak, it has been denied by President Trump. It has been denied by the former acting Director of National Intelligence, Richard Grenell, and it's been denied by the current Director of National Intelligence, former Congressman Ratcliffe. Now, none of these people is a super credible witness, and people who are close enough to politics to listen to a show like yours know that. Meanwhile, let's note who has not spoken about the story. No comment from the Secretary of Defense. No comment for the CIA director. No comment from, by the way, Mike Pence, who was also named as one of those briefed. No comment from Mike Pompeo, who is a very artful liar, but doesn't like to directly lie. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say call him a liar. He is an artful misleader, but he doesn't like to directly lie. And you notice Pompeo's answers, although when you go read the transcript where he has been misleading, he has effectively changed the subject or veered away or insulted the interviewer or done something so he doesn't put a flat out untruth on the record.
Right.
So there's obviously a lot of power behind this story. Even if it turns out that we are dealing with raw intelligence and there's some question marks over what exactly happened inside Afghanistan, the Washington part of the story, which is that there was information flow that Trump is denying, that part seems pretty solid.
And we do know from Fiona Hill and John Bolton and John Kelly and others that the intelligence briefings, the daily intelligence briefings, are not necessarily something that Donald Trump pays a lot of attention to, shall we say.
Right. Well, there are a lot of possibilities here. Again, we have to be really careful that this is an emerging story. But the intelligence agencies are certainly staked. There are a lot of people briefing a lot of people inside, briefing a lot of different people outside. This story has been briefed to the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the BBC, and now the AP on the day you and I speak. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of power behind it. It's possible. There's one other possibility about this, which is there was in March and April a flurry of calls between Trump and Vladimir Putin, much more. I think there were half a dozen in the span of a couple of weeks, which is a faster pace than usual. It may have been that Trump was trying to exaggerated, as he often does, his relationship with Putin, and was somehow trying to do personal diplomacy to settle the story, and that he made some effort that then failed, and then because he was embarrassed by his failure, he's now lying to cover his tracks. So I think it shows that we have a really dysfunctional government, and we have a president who has lost the confidence and trust of important sectors of the military and the intelligence services. And that's the theme of the Trumpocalypse book.
Exactly. And as you point out, there are still, this is a developing story, it's an emerging story. But one, and you've already referenced this, one evidence we do have, manifest evidence of Donald Trump's leadership or lack of, is the administration's response and his personal response to the coronavirus pandemic. Mm-hmm. The Atlantic is out, I'm sure you've seen it, with a piece just, I think, yesterday saying, well, in the first phase, Donald Trump may have not given this enough attention, and he might have made the case, well, this is something came from China. But now he owns it. It is his. What do you see we learn from his response to the pandemic?
Well, I am familiar with that story. I wrote it for The Atlantic, and it was a sequel to a story. I wrote on April 7th. The first story tracked Donald Trump's negligence in December, January, February, March, and how by not acting effectively, he allowed this thing to spiral out of control in a way that was worse than in any other comparably developed country. But Americans rallied. And at enormous sacrifice to their businesses, to their jobs, their pay, to their schooling. I think the damage to children's schooling is going to endure for years as a result of this. But the country was shut down. And between the first peak, national peak, on April 27th and the national low on May 11th, we reduced the infection rate in the country by about half, from about 38,000 cases a day at the end of April to about 17,000 cases a day by the middle of May. And at that point, Trump said, okay, I'm bored. I'm done. Mm-hmm. We're going to reopen everywhere. And not only are we going to reopen anywhere, but if anyone wears a mask, I will take it as a personal criticism. I will be offended by that, and I will make fun of it. And my Fox News apparatus will mock you. And he succeeded in persuading, while a majority of Americans understood they needed to mask, only 40% of Republicans agreed. And so in Republican-dominated states like Texas, like Florida, masking became very unusual. And the result is that we now have spikes at the end of June that are higher, not yet as deadly as what happened in April, but the number of cases per day is higher than it was at the worst at the end of April. All of that sacrifice was wasted, and it was wasted by the president's vanity because he sees the mask as a personal criticism, not as a safety measure.
And yet, does he do so with impunity? That's a point that you make, I thought, very powerful in the book, that he's done so much that we couldn't believe, but he gets away with it.
Well, he's had more success with some institutions than with others. And we're talking for a minute about the military in Afghanistan. The military has been one of the institutions least vulnerable to President Trump. That's one of the things that could change in a second term. That Trump is not very knowledgeable about military promotions. I think there's something like 4,000 one-star generals in the U.S. Army, or maybe it's 4,000 colonels and 1,200 one-stars. I don't have that figure, but there are a lot of. If you're looking for Trumpy, anti-democratic, reactionary people, you have to sift through a lot of names and really know what you're doing. But in a second term, he might. But to date, the military has been very robust. The Department of Justice, no, and the failures in Congress are the worst. And it is Congress, and especially the Republicans in Congress, that have given this president his impunity, where he's decided, I don't answer subpoenas if I don't want to. I don't tell the truth to Congress if I don't want to, and no one can do anything.
And how did that happen? I mean, I'm really puzzled. Look, I'm a Democrat. I've always been a Democrat. But my first job was working for a Republican. I hate to use the old cliche, but some of my best friends have been Republicans. I mean, in Washington and in California, I can't believe how the Republican Party, in just a matter of months, went from not taking Donald Trump seriously to being in his hip pocket, basically. A total surrender almost. And how do you read? I mean, what's your take on that?
Well, I quote in Trumpocalypse a congressman from Florida, Ted Yoho, who said, I work for the president. I answer to the president. Now, his district in Florida, I may not remember this exactly, voted about 55% for Donald Trump in 2016. So 45%, not quite half, but nearly half of his district voted against Donald Trump. You would have thought that the congressman worked for that 45% as well as the 55% that did. And 20 years ago, a congressman would think, or a member of Congress would think, yeah, I represent my district. Mm-hmm. I may be a Republican member of Congress. I am a Republican member of Congress. And if we send a subpoena and a president of my party ignores that, maybe as a Republican, I have one reaction, but my first identity as a member of Congress, you reply to our subpoenas because that's where I make my career. That's my identity. That's my job. I answer to my constituents. And what has happened is we have no more Congress. We have two parties in Congress, and they are members of their party first and members of their institution only second. And that's a product of bigger changes in American life.
And you talk about the need for some of those changes in the second part of the book, which we'll get to. But were you surprised to see some Republicans, like a Lindsey Graham or like a Marco Rubio, those who were openly, and Ted Cruz, very critical of Trump during the primary? Paul Ryan at one point wouldn't even appear on stage with him, suddenly become Trump's biggest defenders.
Yeah, it's remarkable, isn't it? Trump, he's not obviously very well informed, and he's not even maybe conventionally clever in the way that many politicians are clever, but he's got this kind of like reptile instinct for weakness. Yeah. And he just finds it. Yep. And he breaks people. And he's broken Lindsey Graham. I think what's happened to Marco Rubio is actually more embarrassing than what's happened to Lindsey Graham, because Graham is doing this with his eyes open, and he's trading. He's getting stuff. He's got his some stuff policy, some stuff for his district, but he's got a vision. I've made a deal with the devil, and I'm checking my receipts, and I'm making sure that the packages actually do arrive. Whereas Rubio just seems like a broken, shattered person, and Ted Cruz seems like Ted Cruz just thinks, hey, I'm 35 years younger than Donald Trump. He won't be here forever, and my future depends on just getting through this awful period. And then I can stick around to clean up the pieces. But Rubio won't be around to pick up the pieces because he is the pieces. He's just smashed.
I did not remember this, probably read it at the time, but on Inauguration Day 2017, you tweeted, quote, "the worst human being ever to enter the presidency," including, you said, those who owned slaves. That proven true?
I think so, because even for other presidents of personality weakness, we can say something positive about all of them. Like Andrew Johnson, who was the president, the first president to be impeached, and who was the most virulent racist ever to hold the presidency, and a drunkard on top of that, and would get drunk. So a lot of, and the man who nearly gave away Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson was physically brave. He had been a Civil War military governor of Tennessee. His life had been under constant threat. He had held the post of duty. He had never run away. You could say that about him. Andrew Johnson had also been born into really severe poverty. He'd grown up illiterate. He had educated himself. You could say that about him. And you could go through the list, like John Tyler, who turned traitor, went and served in the Confederate Congress. He was an incredibly devoted husband and father, and his house still stands, and it's still in his family, and the personal affection. Now that doesn't offset his public faults, but there's something. You can do. I mean, Richard Nixon. You remember him from your early political career. A profound intellect, and the tragedy of Nixon is that so much ability was not put, and a person also of great accomplishment. He wrote our environment, every major piece of environment.
Exactly.
He wrote all of that. He had a vision of peace and foreign policy, and we are endlessly fascinated with him because he's so tragic, because of those abilities. And even Warren Harding was a lot of fun at a party.
Which gets you a long way in Washington, right?
But I challenge you, say something good about Donald Trump.
And we'll leave that challenge right there. You're not going to get it from me. But I was really moved when you called your daughter on election night. Yeah. And the message to your daughter was, "We failed you." Wow.
Yeah. Well, because I've been involved in the Republican world for a long time. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say we built this monster, but we built the lab in which the monster was built. And I worked very hard. As I'm now a journalist, I'm not involved in politics exactly, but I lent every effort of my pen to stop him in 2015 and 2016. And this is my youngest daughter. I had called home. I'd been in a TV booth, and you know what that's like. You're actually more isolated from the world. Totally.
Waiting your turn, right?
Exactly. And I finally had a chance to call home. My wife was long since asleep, and the older kids were in California. And I got my youngest, and who had never been that interested in politics before. And she was so scared. She wasn't upset. She was really scared, and with reason.
Bill Press with David Frum, author of Trumpocalypse, Restoring American Democracy. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Tom Conway, Michael Olivas, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.